It was just after sunrise when a modest motorcycle rumbled up to the glass and steel headquarters of Kingsley and Company. Real estate, a company worth over $500 million and renowned across the U.S. for its elite commercial holdings and upscale developments. Suits were already flooding through the revolving doors, men and women in polished Oxfords and high heels, sipping triple-shot lattes and speaking into Bluetooth earpieces as they strutted across the marble lobby floor. But nobody noticed the young man on the bike. He wore a gray hoodie, faded jeans, and carried an old canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. His sneakers were scuffed, and his helmet, which he tucked under his arm, had more than a few scratches. To passers-by, he looked like a food delivery driver or maybe someone here to fix the plumbing. His name was Michael Carter, and unknown to every single employee inside that building, he was the firstborn son of the company's founder, Richard Kingsley. Michael's late mother, a brilliant African-American educator from Atlanta, had raised him to be humble, wise, and strong. After her passing, Michael had moved overseas, earning degrees in architecture and business from top European universities, all while staying away from the public eye. His father, Richard, a powerful white businessman, had remarried and kept the company running, but Michael had stayed distant, quietly building his own identity. Now, at 32, Michael was back. Not as the CEO, yet, but as a silent observer. He had heard troubling rumors, complaints of racial bias in promotions, whispers that minority employees were being overlooked or mistreated, and that the company's values had drifted far from what his mother would have believed in. So he came undercover. No press release. No security detail. Just himself, dressed like any struggling young man trying to catch a break. He wanted to see the truth with his own eyes, to walk the same halls as the janitors and assistants, to feel what they felt, and to listen to how people spoke when they thought no one important was listening. As he approached the front doors, he could already feel the stares. People in pressed suits looked him up and down with suspicion. A receptionist leaned over to whisper something to a colleague. And then came Douglas Matthews, the operations manager, puffed up in a navy blazer and Italian leather shoes, who barely looked Michael in the eye before barking, "Deliveries go around back." Michael paused. There it was, the first taste of what he'd come looking for. He gave a small smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Actually," he said, "I was wondering if you had any job openings." And just like that, the heir to a multi-million-dollar empire was officially stepping into the shadows, ready to uncover the truth and reclaim the legacy his mother had dreamed of. Michael Carter barely had time to breathe in the scent of fresh polished marble and cologne before the judgment began. As he stepped through the grand entrance of Kingsley and Company, the double glass doors whooshed shut behind him. The interior gleamed, white floors, brass finishes, and glass panels everywhere. It looked more like a five-star hotel than a real estate headquarters. But the people inside? They didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat. Two young receptionists, both seated behind a curved walnut desk, looked up. Their eyes flicked from his hoodie to his worn backpack to his unshaven face. One of them narrowed her eyes, then leaned to whisper something that made the other one snicker. Michael didn't flinch. He had expected this. He had dressed down on purpose, to see what it felt like to walk through the front doors of his own future company looking like someone nobody wanted there. Then came the moment that told him everything. From the corner office, Douglas Matthews, the operations manager, strutted out like he was the king of the castle. Mid-40s, barrel-chested, with slick back hair and a gold tie clip that looked like it cost more than Michael's entire outfit. He stopped short when he saw Michael, immediately scowling like he'd found a stain on the rug. "Hey, buddy," Douglas said, gesturing with a coffee cup in one hand. "Deliveries go around back." Michael raised an eyebrow. "I'm not delivering anything," he replied calmly. "I'm actually looking for work." That gave Douglas pause, just long enough to look Michael up and down again. "What kind of work?" he asked, not even trying to hide the condescension in his voice. "I'll take whatever's available," Michael said. "I just need a foot in the door." Douglas turned to one of the receptionists. "Check if we've got anything open, something suitable." The receptionist smirked as she tapped a few keys. "Janitorial staff has one opening," she said. "Night shift." Douglas grinned as if the universe had just handed him a joke. "Perfect. What do you say, big guy? You wanted an opportunity." Michael gave a thoughtful nod. "I'll take it." The smirks turned into muffled laughter. A few employees walking by slowed down, catching enough of the exchange to shake their heads. A tall, black man in scruffy clothes accepting a janitor job at one of the most prestigious real estate companies in the country? To them, it was comedy. But to Michael, it was golden. He had just been handed a front-row seat to the exact culture he suspected had taken root, one that judged by appearance, by race, by class. He took the mop with a quiet smile. Not because he had to, but because it was time to see the truth from the ground floor up. Michael Carter's first shift as a janitor at Kingsley and Company began just before 7 a.m. The building sparkled in the morning sun, but behind its glass and marble beauty lurked something far less polished. He was handed a mop, a bucket, and a sour look from his new supervisor, Karen Whitmore, head of janitorial services. A tall, rigid woman in her late 50s with bleached blonde hair and a permanent scowl, Karen made it clear from their very first interaction that she had no patience for people like him. "You missed a spot," she snapped, pointing to a floor he had just cleaned. Michael bent down again, without a word. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to observe, to see just how deep the rot went. What he found was worse than he imagined. Every time he passed through a hallway, he could feel the stares. Some employees whispered behind their hands. Others ignored him completely, like he wasn't even there. The ones who did speak to him did so with thinly veiled contempt. Karen, in particular, made it her mission to remind him of his place. On his second day, after he had cleaned the executive lounge to a shine, she stormed in, eyes narrowed. "Is this how you mop at home?" she barked. "This floor looks like it's been licked, not cleaned." Michael looked at the spotless tile, then back at her. "Would you like me to go over it again?" he asked, calm as ever. "Don't get smart with me," she hissed. "I don't like your attitude. I don't like your tone. And I definitely don't like your kind walking around here like you belong." That phrase, "your kind," hung in the air like the stink of bleach. Then there was Douglas Matthews. The manager who had dismissed Michael at the front door now made it a game to torment him. He'd intentionally spill coffee, then snap his fingers for Michael to clean it up. More than once, he called him boy in front of other staff, something that echoed like a slap in a place where titles and status meant everything. But Michael didn't flinch. He never raised his voice. Never broke character. He quietly logged every word, every insult, every smirk. Only one or two employees showed any decency. Linda, a middle-aged receptionist with graying curls and gentle eyes, once slipped him a bottled water and whispered, "Don't let them get to you, honey." He gave her a soft smile. That small gesture, kindness without expectation, meant more than she knew. Michael had walked into this company a mystery. Now, he was becoming something more, a witness. And the truth he was uncovering was painful, familiar, and shameful. They saw a janitor. They saw a black man in a hoodie. But what they didn't see was the future CEO watching every move. In the middle of all the cold shoulders, snide remarks, and sideways glances, Michael Carter discovered something unexpected, a flicker of kindness. It didn't come in grand gestures or loud support. It came in quiet moments, the kind that reveal a person's heart when no one else is looking. One of those hearts belonged to Linda Monroe, a receptionist who'd been with Kingsley and Company for over 20 years. She had a gentle face, streaks of silver in her dark curls, and a voice that still carried a soft Tennessee drawl. While the other receptionists rolled their eyes or giggled behind their hands when Michael passed by with his mop, Linda looked him in the eye and gave him something rare in that building: respect. "You holding up okay, sweetheart?" she asked one morning, slipping him a bottle of cold water from her mini fridge behind the desk. Michael blinked. No one had asked him that. Not once. "Yes, ma'am," he said, offering a small smile. "Thank you." Linda smiled back. "Don't let this place change who you are. Some folks forget where they came from once they get a little title next to their name." That simple exchange stayed with Michael longer than all the insults. There was also Marcus, a night security guard who worked the swing shift. A retired Army vet with a bad knee and a love for jazz, Marcus didn't say much, but he always nodded respectfully when Michael passed through. One night, around 10:30 p.m., Michael was still scrubbing coffee stains off the conference room carpet when Marcus popped his head in. "Company this big," Marcus said quietly, "you'd think people would remember how to treat each other." Michael paused, then nodded. "You'd think." Marcus gave him a knowing look, then disappeared down the hall. These moments weren't dramatic. They didn't happen under a spotlight. But in a place where arrogance seemed baked into the drywall, they meant the world. Michael took note of every one of them. Not just the people who hurt him, but the ones who chose to be decent even when no one was watching. In his mind, these were the people who embodied what his mother used to teach: character is how you treat those you think can do nothing for you. Linda didn't know he was the CEO's son. Marcus had no idea he'd one day be answering to Michael. Yet they treated him with dignity anyway. That's what made the difference. As the days wore on, the cruelty of some made the warmth of a few shine even brighter. And while Michael would never forget the ones who looked down on him, it was the ones who looked him in the eye, with empathy, not pity, who would shape the future of Kingsley and Company. Because when the storm finally broke, it was those kind souls who would be standing in the light. It was a crisp Wednesday morning when everything changed. The office buzzed with the usual hum of printers, clicking heels, and voices echoing off glass walls. But a single phone call would bring all of that to a standstill. The receptionist's phone rang just after 9 a.m. She answered with her usual practiced cheer, but her smile vanished in seconds. Her back straightened. Her tone shifted. She stammered, then hung up quickly. "He's coming," she whispered to no one in particular. "Mr. Kingsley, the founder." Within minutes, the entire building snapped to attention like a military base preparing for inspection. Jackets were buttoned, ties tightened, desks cleared. Even Douglas Matthews, the smug operations manager, combed his hair in the reflection of a framed award. In his mind, this was his moment. He could already see himself shaking Richard Kingsley's hand, getting praised for maintaining order, maybe even positioning himself for a VP title. What Douglas didn't realize was that the ground beneath him was about to give way. Then came the sound. A soft ding from the elevator. The doors opened, and in stepped Richard Kingsley, tall, silver-haired, and sharp as ever in a tailored charcoal suit. He had the kind of presence that silenced a room without saying a word. Employees stood taller. Karen Whitmore even applied a fresh swipe of lipstick. Richard moved to the center of the lobby and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today marks a new era for Kingsley and Company. After years of building this company from the ground up, it's time to pass the torch." There were murmurs, whispers. Everyone craned their necks, expecting a slick young executive in a $1,000 suit to step forward. "Allow me to introduce," Richard continued, "my firstborn son, and your new CEO, Michael Carter." Silence. Utter silence. All eyes turned. But not toward the executives. Not toward the finance team. They turned to the janitor. Michael stood at the back of the room, still in his uniform, mop in hand. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Karen's mouth dropped open. Douglas blinked so fast it looked like he was short-circuiting. Michael stepped forward, his posture strong, his expression calm, but there was steel in his eyes. "Surprised?" he asked quietly. "You should be." He paused, letting the truth sink in. "I walked these halls for days. I cleaned your floors. I was invisible to most of you. Some of you mocked me. Some of you treated me like I didn't belong." His voice never wavered. "But I do belong. Because this company, my mother's dream, my father's legacy, is now in my hands." Gasps filled the room. Karen turned pale. Douglas looked like he'd seen a ghost. And just like that, the game was over. The janitor was the boss. And the people who thought they were untouchable, they were about to learn otherwise. For a moment, the office was frozen in time. You could have heard a paperclip hit the floor. Michael Carter stood at the front of the room, mop in hand, but the air around him had shifted. He was no longer invisible. Douglas Matthews, so full of arrogance just minutes earlier, now looked like he might faint. Karen Whitmore, red-faced and breathless, clutched the edge of a desk like it was the only thing holding her upright. And then, from the edge of the room, the man who had built it all stepped forward. Richard Kingsley stood tall beside his son, his expression unreadable, but his pride unmistakable. "I've seen enough," Richard said simply, his voice calm but firm. "Michael, what do you think should be done?" The question hung in the air like thunder. Michael didn't hesitate. He looked directly at Douglas first. "You dismissed me the moment you saw me. You called me boy. You spilled coffee just so I'd clean it. You treated me like garbage, not knowing I was your future boss." Douglas stammered, his voice shaky. "Sir, I didn't know." Michael raised a hand. "Exactly. That's the problem. You only show respect when you think someone matters." Then he turned to Karen. Her eyes pleaded for mercy. "And you," Michael said, his voice steady. "You humiliated me daily. Called me names. Threw coffee across a table and made me clean it in front of others. You didn't just supervise, you bullied." Karen's lips quivered. I was just following policy." Michael's expression hardened. Since when is cruelty company policy? The silence was deafening. He turned to his father. "They can't stay. Not if we're going to rebuild this company on values like fairness and respect." Richard nodded solemnly. "Douglas Matthews," he said, "your employment is terminated immediately." Douglas's face went pale. "Please, sir." But Richard didn't waver. He turned to Karen. "Karen Whitmore, you are relieved of your duties, effective now." Karen gasped, nearly stumbling. "Please, Mr. Kingsley, I didn't mean." Michael stepped forward, voice low and firm. "You meant every word. Every action. You just didn't think you'd have to answer for them." And with that, the two who had ruled the lower ranks with intimidation and cruelty were escorted out, stripped not only of their titles, but of the illusion of superiority they had clung to. Around the room, employees stood silent, faces pale, some ashamed. The message was loud and clear: this was a new day. The days of unchecked power and silent cruelty were over. And as Michael watched Douglas and Karen disappear down the hall, he didn't feel triumph or vengeance. He felt clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Because respect shouldn't depend on who's watching. And now, everyone was watching. After the tension of the terminations, a heavy silence lingered in the air. Employees stood motionless, some avoiding eye contact, others silently digesting what had just unfolded. But amidst a sea of shocked faces, Michael Carter's eyes found the one that had stood out from the very beginning: Linda Monroe. She had never raised her voice, never made a scene. But in a place where cruelty had been the currency of power, she had chosen compassion. Michael took a slow step forward, still in his janitor's uniform, though no one dared look down on him now. His voice, steady and clear, filled the room. "This company is about to change," he said. "And change starts by recognizing the people who uphold the right values, even when no one's watching." Then he turned to Linda. "Linda Monroe," he said, his tone softening, "you were one of the only people in this building who treated me with kindness. You didn't know who I was. You had nothing to gain. But you chose decency." Linda's eyes widened. She looked around, unsure if he was really speaking to her. "You offered me water on a hot day. You called me sweetheart when others wouldn't even look at me. You reminded me of the dignity my mother always carried herself with." There was a pause. A few employees shifted, clearly affected. Michael glanced at his father, who gave a small approving nod. "As my first act as CEO," Michael continued, "I'm promoting you to Director of Employee Relations, effective immediately." A gasp rippled through the room. Linda's hand flew to her chest. "Oh, honey, are you serious?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael smiled warmly. "As serious as it gets." Linda blinked back tears. She had spent years behind that front desk, answering phones, smiling through stress, and being overlooked. She never imagined she'd be standing in the spotlight, let alone for simply being kind. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You already said everything," Michael replied, "with your actions." A few people clapped. Then more. Soon the room erupted in full applause, not just for Linda, but for what she represented, a return to values that had been lost. Michael knew not everyone had been cruel. Some employees had simply stayed silent, unsure of what to do. But Linda had reminded him that even a small gesture, a kind word, a shared moment of humanity, could stand out like a lighthouse in a storm. And now, it was her time to rise. Not because of politics. Not because of favors. But because character still mattered. And under Michael Carter's leadership, that would never be overlooked again. With the applause for Linda still echoing in the lobby, Michael Carter stepped back, letting the moment breathe. He could feel the weight of the room shift, not just from shock, but from realization. This wasn't just about unmasking cruelty. It was about building something better. He turned to face the entire staff, executives, assistants, custodians, managers, all of them gathered in silence. For the first time, they weren't looking at him as the janitor, or even the boss. They were listening. Really listening. Michael took a breath, his voice steady. "This company was built by my father, but it was inspired by my mother," he began. She believed in hard work, fairness, and treating every person with dignity, no matter what title they held or what clothes they wore. There were nods from some of the older employees, including a few who had been around long enough to remember Richard Kingsley's early days, back when the office had only one floor and a small break room with a drip coffee maker. But somewhere along the way, Michael continued, we lost sight of that. Somewhere, arrogance crept in. Judgment replaced kindness. And respect became something only reserved for the powerful. He paused, letting his words sink in. That ends today. Murmurs stirred again. Not resistance, reflection. Effective immediately, Kingsley and Company will begin a full internal audit of company culture and management practices. A new respect and equity policy will be introduced, and every employee, at every level, will undergo training on ethics, leadership, and workplace dignity. People were truly listening now. Michael's tone didn't carry anger, it carried resolve. Hiring will be more inclusive. Promotions will be based on merit, not appearances or office politics. And I will personally read every complaint that reaches the executive desk. He turned, gesturing toward Linda. We'll also be creating a new employee relations division, led by people who understand what it's like to be overlooked and undervalued. That department will have the authority to investigate any mistreatment, without fear of retaliation. There was a beat of silence. Then, unexpectedly, a few employees clapped, tentatively at first, then more joined. It wasn't the polite, corporate kind of applause. It was genuine. Michael nodded. If you're sitting here today and you know you've treated someone unfairly, this is your opportunity to change. If you've been silent while others were mistreated, this is your moment to speak up. He glanced around the room. But if you believe in what we're building, and you're ready to help create a workplace rooted in respect, fairness, and real opportunity, then I want you here. Then came the final line, the one that would be remembered long after the floors were cleaned and the lights turned off. This company will no longer be measured by profits alone, but by how we treat the people who help build it. And with that, the future of Kingsley and Company began. The story of Michael Carter's Undercover return to his family's company isn't just a dramatic tale, it's a reflection of values that many of us, especially those who've lived long enough to witness life's highs and lows, hold dear: respect, humility, justice, and the true measure of character. At its heart, this story reminds us that how we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us says more about who we are than any resume or title ever could. Michael walked the halls of his own company as a janitor, not for recognition, but to observe the truth. What he discovered was painful but revealing, a culture that had replaced compassion with status, and courtesy with condescension. For many older adults, this hits home. We've seen how times have changed. We've watched companies grow fast, yet forget the very principles they were built on: hard work, decency, and fairness. But the lesson here isn't just about corporate America. It's about everyday life. Whether you're managing a team, raising a family, or greeting a stranger in line at the grocery store, the message is the same: respect costs nothing, but means everything. We are reminded, too, that small acts of kindness matter. Linda, the receptionist, didn't know she was speaking to the future CEO when she offered a simple bottle of water and a kind word. But that moment spoke volumes. In a world that often rewards noise and flash, she showed that quiet integrity still counts. And finally, this story teaches us about the importance of accountability, not out of revenge, but out of responsibility. Michael's decision to remove toxic leadership wasn't driven by pride, it was rooted in the need to protect others from harm and rebuild something stronger. As we look at our own lives, whether retired, still working, or mentoring the next generation, this story calls on us to be the Lindas of the world. To stand up, speak kindly, and never underestimate the impact of a moment of grace. Because in the end, it's not titles, wealth, or power that define us. It's how we treat the people who have none of those things, yet still deserve our respect.